The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights, nor did it come with any visible danger that might reasonably justify panic. It arrived instead through a carefully worded email sent just after sunrise, marked with a red banner labeled Urgent HOA Notice, announcing that the neighborhood was now operating under what the HOA president described as Temporary Emergency Authority. The message was vague, intentionally so, offering no concrete. The first sign that something was wrong did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights, nor did it come with any visible danger that might reasonably justify panic. It arrived instead through a carefully worded email sent just after sunrise, marked with a red banner labeled Urgent HOA Notice, announcing that the neighborhood was now operating under what the HOA president described as Temporary Emergency Authority. The message was vague, intentionally so, offering no concrete explanation of the threat facing the community, only repeated references to safety, order, and the need for immediate compliance. Within minutes, confusion spread through the neighborhood as homeowners reread the message, trying to identify what exactly had changed and why their rights suddenly felt negotiable. By mid-morning, the effects of the so-called emergency were already visible. Parking enforcement trucks appeared without warning, tagging vehicles that had been legally parked for years. Access gates to shared amenities were locked, despite residents being fully paid and in good standing. Notices were taped to doors citing violations that had never existed before, all stamped with the same phrase, "Emergency powers enacted." The HOA president, already known for her controlling tendencies and obsession with rules, had found a new tool to wield, and she used it with alarming enthusiasm. What unsettled residents most was not just the speed of the changes, but the lack of process. There had been no board meeting, no community vote, no explanation rooted in the HOA's bylaws. The emergency had seemingly materialized out of thin air, declared unilaterally and enforced aggressively. Long-standing permissions were revoked overnight. Renovations previously approved were suddenly frozen. Even routine activities like having guests over were quietly discouraged through threatening notices that hinted at fines and penalties without clearly stating them. As the day went on, rumors filled the information vacuum. Some residents speculated about infrastructure failures. Others whispered about legal issues or insurance problems. Yet no evidence surfaced to support any of it. Maintenance crews went about their normal routines. Utilities functioned as usual. Local authorities had issued no warnings. The only visible change was the HOA's behavior, which had shifted from overbearing to outright authoritarian. For years, the HOA president had cultivated an image of absolute control. She chaired meetings with rigid discipline, dismissed questions she didn't like, and treated the bylaws as tools to punish rather than guidelines to serve the community. Most homeowners tolerated her because her authority had limits, clearly defined by documents few people ever bothered to read closely. But this emergency declaration changed the balance overnight. It allowed her to bypass notice periods, ignore appeals, and issue penalties without review, all while insisting that the situation demanded unquestioned obedience. The neighborhood, once quiet and predictable, became tense. Curtains twitched as residents watched enforcement officers measure driveways and photograph trash bins. Social media groups lit up with screenshots of violation notices and speculation about what might come next. People who had never interacted beyond polite waves now exchanged anxious messages, comparing notes and trying to understand whether this was temporary or the beginning of something far worse. One homeowner, however, responded differently. While others focused on compliance and damage control, this individual began paying attention to details. Not the dramatic ones, but the subtle inconsistencies that often revealed the truth behind authority. The language of the notices was inconsistent, referencing sections of bylaws that did not exist. The fines escalated without explanation. The emergency orders cited no expiration date, no review process, and no specific threat. Most telling of all, the HOA board itself was silent. No statements, no confirmations, no visible involvement from anyone other than the president herself. As hours turned into days, the emergency expanded. New rules appeared daily, often contradicting the ones issued the day before.
Residents were told to move vehicles, then fined for moving them incorrectly. Access to personal property was restricted under the justification of safety inspections that never happened. Each new restriction seemed less connected to community welfare and more aligned with the president's long-standing personal grievances. The power shift was unmistakable. What had once been an HOA bound by documents and procedures now operated like a one-person regime. Appeals were ignored. Emails went unanswered unless they praised the leadership's decisiveness. The phrase emergency powers became a shield against all criticism, repeated so often that some residents began to accept it as legitimate simply out of exhaustion. But beneath the surface, frustration was hardening into resolve. Homeowners who had spent years avoiding conflict began quietly organizing, not to protest openly, but to gather information. Old meeting minutes were dug out of filing cabinets. Copies of bylaws were shared and highlighted. State statutes governing homeowners associations were bookmarked and reread. Patterns began to emerge, showing just how far the current actions strayed from anything legally recognizable as an emergency. The homeowner who had first noticed the inconsistencies took this further, documenting everything: dates, times, notices, enforcement actions, and the absence of required approvals, all carefully recorded. What initially seemed like chaos slowly revealed itself as something much more deliberate. The emergency powers were not being used to address a threat. They were being used to consolidate control, silence dissent, and punish anyone who had ever questioned the HOA president's authority. As the week progressed, the emotional toll on the neighborhood became evident. Families worried about mounting fines. Elderly residents feared losing access to essential services. New homeowners questioned whether they had made a terrible mistake moving in. The HOA president, meanwhile, appeared emboldened, issuing longer notices with harsher language, confident that fear and confusion would keep resistance fragmented. But fear has limits. The more the emergency expanded without explanation, the more its legitimacy eroded. Homeowners began to realize that real emergencies do not require secrecy, and real authority does not fear transparency. Quiet conversations turned into coordinated efforts to understand the law rather than just endure the pressure. By the end of the first week, the neighborhood stood at a crossroads. On the surface, the HOA president's grip seemed stronger than ever, enforced through constant notices and relentless enforcement. Underneath, however, something was shifting. The paper trail was growing. The legal contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. And one homeowner, armed with documents rather than anger, was preparing to test a dangerous question: whether the emergency was real at all or merely the first crack in an authority that had finally gone too far. As the emergency continued with no end in sight, the stage was set for a confrontation, not fueled by shouting or rebellion, but by law, records, and the quiet certainty that power claimed without limits rarely survives being examined. The next step would determine whether the HOA's declaration marked the beginning of permanent control or the moment it all started to fall apart.
The second week of the so-called emergency began with a noticeable shift in the neighborhood's mood, as the initial shock wore off and was replaced by a quieter, more dangerous response: scrutiny. Homeowners who had spent the first days scrambling to comply now began slowing down, rereading notices instead of reacting to them, comparing violations instead of paying them, and noticing that the rules seemed to change depending on who was affected. What had first looked like chaos started to resemble a pattern, and patterns, unlike fear, could be studied. The emergency powers continued to expand, but so did the number of residents quietly questioning how a single person could suspend normal governance without oversight, documentation, or a visible threat. The HOA president doubled down on enforcement. New bulletins appeared almost daily, each more aggressive than the last, each reinforcing the idea that resistance itself was a risk to community safety. Fines increased, deadlines shortened, and vague warnings about further action became common. Yet still, no emergency was identified, no broken infrastructure was repaired, no inspections occurred, no external authority confirmed the situation. The emergency existed only in writing, always bearing the same signature, always lacking the same details.
Behind closed doors, homeowners began gathering information. Not meetings, not protests, but exchanges of documents and timelines. Copies of the HOA bylaws were scanned and shared, revealing sections that had never once mentioned emergency authority, beyond narrowly defined circumstances that required full board approval and immediate documentation. State laws governing homeowners associations were pulled up and read carefully, exposing requirements for notice, due process, and limitations on unilateral action. The more people read, the clearer it became that what was happening did not just feel wrong, it appeared structurally impossible under the law. One homeowner emerged as an unofficial archivist, not by appointment, but by persistence. Every notice was saved, every enforcement photo was time-stamped, every email was categorized. The absence of board meeting minutes became just as important as the presence of violation letters. Patterns of selective enforcement stood out, showing that homes previously involved in disputes with the HOA president were targeted more aggressively, while others were quietly ignored. The emergency powers, it seemed, had preferences. As this information spread quietly, something else changed. Compliance dropped. Cars stayed where they were. Renovation work resumed. Trash cans reappeared on their usual schedules. The fear that had fueled obedience weakened as people realized that enforcement relied heavily on intimidation rather than lawful backing. The HOA president responded by escalating again, issuing warnings that hinted at liens, legal action, and irreversible consequences. But even these threats lacked substance, often misquoting legal terms or referencing procedures that did not exist. The neighborhood social spaces, once filled with casual chatter, now carried an undercurrent of tension mixed with determination. Residents compared notes not out of panic but out of strategy. Elderly homeowners, once the most frightened, became some of the most resolute after learning that state law offered them protections the HOA could not suspend. New homeowners found reassurance in the growing understanding that contracts still mattered, even during declared emergencies. The HOA board's silence grew louder by the day. Members who had previously appeared alongside the president at meetings were nowhere to be seen. No confirmations were issued, no collective statements emerged. Requests for official clarification went unanswered or were met with recycled emergency language that avoided specifics. The absence of institutional backing became impossible to ignore. An authority that refused to show its foundation began to look increasingly fragile. Midway through the week, cracks began to show. A fine was issued incorrectly, citing a rule that had been repealed years earlier. A parking violation was documented with photos taken outside the neighborhood. A notice was sent to the wrong homeowner entirely. These errors, once dismissed as minor, now carried weight. Each mistake became another entry in the growing archive, another indication that enforcement was rushed, careless, and unsupported. The homeowner compiling the records expanded the scope, filing formal requests for documents the HOA was legally required to maintain. Emergency declarations, board votes, insurance notices, correspondence with authorities, items that should have existed if the emergency were real. The responses, when they came at all, were incomplete or non-existent. Deadlines passed without delivery. Excuses replaced explanations. The lack of documentation became the most compelling evidence of all. As the pressure mounted, the HOA president's tone shifted from confident to defensive. Notices grew longer, filled with repeated assertions of authority, but still devoid of facts. The emergency powers were no longer described as temporary, they were framed as necessary until full compliance was achieved, a condition so vague it could last indefinitely. What was once presented as a response to a crisis now resembled a test of endurance. Yet the more control was asserted, the less effective it became. Homeowners stopped reacting emotionally and began responding procedurally. Certified letters replaced emails, deadlines were acknowledged but challenged, enforcement actions were met with formal disputes rather than hurried payments. The emergency, stripped of unquestioned obedience, began to slow. By the end of the second week, the neighborhood no longer felt like a community under siege, but like one standing at the edge of a reckoning. The emergency powers still existed on paper, but their impact weakened as knowledge spread and fear receded. The archive of evidence had grown thick enough to tell a story of its own, one that suggested the emergency was not a response to danger, but a reckless overreach built on the assumption that no one would push back. As residents prepared for the next step, moving beyond documentation towards formal challenge, the realization settled in that the HOA president's greatest miscalculation had not been declaring an emergency, it had been assuming authority, once claimed, would never be questioned. The law, however, had a way of inviting questions, and the answers were beginning to take shape, setting the stage for consequences that could no longer be avoided.
By the third week, the neighborhood had settled into an uneasy rhythm, one that was no longer dominated by panic, but by quiet resistance. The initial frenzy of compliance had faded, replaced with methodical scrutiny. Homeowners were no longer reacting impulsively to every notice. Instead, they were studying them, comparing dates, cross-referencing bylaws, and cataloging violations with painstaking precision. The so-called emergency had revealed itself not as a genuine threat, but as a test of power, and the community was beginning to understand that fear was only as strong as the misinformation that fueled it. The HOA president, who had previously thrived on intimidation and control, started to encounter the first cracks in her authority. Her notices, once met with unquestioned compliance, now drew formal inquiries and disputes. Every new restriction was met with requests for clarification, legal citations, or documented justification. What had been a one-sided enforcement operation became an exchange of documents and procedural challenges, exposing the fragility of unilateral power. Residents discovered that much of the president's emergency authority was unsupported by the HOA's own governing documents. References to non-existent bylaws, misquoted state statutes, and selective enforcement patterns were now impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's underground network of documentation grew stronger. Homeowners shared scanned notices, photos of alleged violations, and copies of board meeting minutes from years prior. They cross-checked emergency claims against state HOA regulations, exposing the president's misinterpretations and omissions. The emergency powers that had seemed invincible when first announced now faced the cold scrutiny of logic, precedent, and law. The president, sensing the shift in power, attempted to regain control with more aggressive measures. Fines increased dramatically. Enforcement letters became longer, more ominous, and filled with legal jargon that often misrepresented statutes. Yet these actions only strengthened the resolve of the homeowners. Each inflated threat was met with methodical counteraction. Certified letters disputing fines, documented timelines of selective enforcement, and requests for board accountability. What had been a one-sided emergency had begun to turn into a neighborhood-led investigation. Tensions escalated during one particularly critical day when a new notice arrived that threatened liens on multiple properties for minor infractions. Homeowners convened in private, sharing discoveries that revealed just how extreme and unnecessary the president's actions had become. They realized that the emergency powers, while dramatic on paper, lacked enforceable legal standing without board approval and documentation that did not exist. The realization spread quickly. The president had overreached, and the law was quietly on the side of the residents. The emotional atmosphere in the neighborhood changed as well. Fear began to transform into cautious optimism. Families who had been hiding indoors, avoiding interaction with the HOA, now discussed strategy openly. Social media groups, once filled with panic and confusion, shifted towards organized, factual discussions. The community was no longer reacting to the president's declarations. They were preparing to challenge them formally. Small victories began to appear. Notices were contested successfully, fines were reversed, and homeowners who had been singled out for enforcement began receiving acknowledgments that their disputes were valid. These wins, though procedural rather than dramatic, sent ripples through the neighborhood. The once feared emergency powers were losing their bite. The president's confidence, previously unshakable, now began to show subtle cracks. Emails became defensive, and the tone of enforcement letters shifted from absolute authority to repetitive justifications that revealed uncertainty. By the end of the week, a new reality had taken hold. The emergency, once a tool of fear, had been transformed into a test of the HOA president's credibility and legal authority.
Homeowners had organized, documented, and begun to fight back not with confrontation, but with knowledge and procedure. The groundwork was laid for a confrontation that would not rely on emotion or intimidation, but on facts, records, and law. A confrontation that promised to expose the president's overreach completely. As the chapter closed, the neighborhood stood at the threshold of turning the tide. The president still claimed emergency powers, but those claims were now surrounded by evidence of illegality, selective enforcement, and procedural failures. The residents understood that the next phase would require careful strategy, precise documentation, and unity, because the law, once invoked correctly, had the power to strip the emergency of its authority entirely. And for the first time, the community felt that victory was possible, not through rebellion, but through the methodical dismantling of the president's unilateral power. The stage was set for a legal showdown, one that would test not just the authority of the HOA president, but the resilience, courage, and intelligence of every homeowner willing to challenge the emergency that had held them captive for too long. The next chapter would reveal how the first formal steps to reclaim control unfolded, and how the president's empire of fear would begin to crumble under the weight of scrutiny.
By the 5th week, the momentum of the homeowners' resistance had become undeniable. What had started as quiet documentation and cautious scrutiny had evolved into an organized campaign to reclaim authority from the HOA president, whose unilateral emergency powers were rapidly losing credibility. Residents, once paralyzed by fear, now operated with confidence and precision, meticulously challenging each notice, fine, and directive with evidence-backed documentation. The neighborhood had discovered a powerful truth. The more aggressively the president had exercised control, the more mistakes she had made, and every misstep was now being leveraged to dismantle her claimed authority. The HOA president, once seemingly untouchable, now appeared increasingly desperate. Notices became erratic, deadlines conflicted with each other, and the language in letters often contradicted previous claims. Her selective enforcement, previously hidden in plain sight, was now exposed across multiple households. Homeowners compared notes and created detailed logs of incidents, violations, and communications, highlighting patterns of bias and misuse of power. The facade of control was cracking. Each misapplied fine, each improperly cited bylaw, each missing record served as evidence that the emergency powers were being wielded unlawfully. Internal board members, long silent, could no longer ignore the growing unrest and the mounting evidence. Some began to question their own participation, realizing that the president's actions not only violated legal guidelines, but also exposed them to potential liability. The once monolithic support for the president now showed fractures as subtle hesitations and conflicting memos emerged. The board's inaction, previously a shield for unilateral power, became another point of vulnerability, and homeowners capitalized on this, formally requesting board oversight and intervention in accordance with state law. The neighborhood, now acting in unison, escalated the legal challenge. Homeowners submitted detailed requests for records, filed formal disputes for fines, and, with attorney guidance, prepared petitions that cited precise sections of HOA bylaws and state statutes. Each submission further reinforced the narrative that the emergency powers were illegitimate, and the president's attempts to counter with threats of liens and penalties were undermined by procedural errors, misquotations of law, and selective enforcement that could now be documented and presented publicly if necessary. Emotionally, the community underwent a transformation. Anxiety and fear gave way to determination and unity. Families who had once retreated from engagement began attending meetings, sharing evidence, and supporting neighbors. Social media threads, once filled with confusion and panic, became hubs for legal strategy, step-by-step instructions for documenting violations, and coordinated responses to notices. The residents had transformed their fear into power, and their coordinated efforts created pressure the president could no longer ignore.
Despite the president's increasingly desperate attempts to reassert control, the first major cracks were undeniable. Notices were contested successfully, fines were overturned, and some board members began questioning the legality of past actions. The public exposure of selective enforcement, procedural errors, and legal missteps became an unassailable record that undermined the president's credibility and authority. The once feared emergency powers were now a source of ridicule and resistance rather than intimidation. By midweek, the first discussions of formal hearings emerged. Homeowners realized that their next step required more than documentation in informal disputes. It required a coordinated legal confrontation. Attorneys drafted petitions to challenge the emergency declaration, citing state law limitations on HOA authority, procedural missteps, and selective enforcement.